German climate pavilion at COP29 in Baku. Germany. Climate solutions, fast and fair.
Good morning, or good day, is it maybe. Warmly welcome to this side event titled Implementing the COP28 Energy Package, African Perspectives and Opportunities for SDG7, which is, of course, affordable and clean energy. I will start by a very practical piece of information. There is translation available. Headsets can be picked up from the counter over there. The panel have their headsets lying here. There are 3 channels. Channel 2 is the floor, so the spoken language. Channel 3 is English, and channel 4 is French. My name is Lydén. I'm the head of international climate policy at Germanwatch, a NGO/think tank based in Berlin and Bonn. We are organizing this side event together with several other organizations. We don't have the logos here, big thank you to MISEREOR, to Powershift Africa, to CESAO, and to the Friedrich Ebert Foundation. I would, of course, also thank the guests, the panelists, which will be introduced properly by our facilitator, which I will introduce in a moment. But maybe a short scene setting. Last year was a milestone in terms of decisions at COPs. The energy package that was part of the global stocktake and the cover decision in Dubai was groundbreaking, I'd say. We have not seen the implementation of this yet. By far, what is necessary has not been done. And the same is true for the Sustainable Development Goal number 7, access to energy, affordable energy and clean energy. We only have 5 years until 2030, and by then the Sustainable Development Goals should actually be fulfilled. Likewise, we know the trajectory for the global warming. We know that every 1/10 of a degree is important, and we know the urgency needed in cutting emissions. So, looking specifically to Africa, which has the resources and the potential to lead the world in renewable energy, which would be a great contribution to the global goal of tripling renewable energy. There are not yet the means to get this into reality. Big parts of the continent remains on the margins of the global energy transition, which is, of course, neither fair nor wise. So we must seek the levers and enablers to ensure that both these goals, the climate goals and the energy goals of the Sustainable Development, or the Agenda 2030, can be reached, especially in Africa. So in this side event, we want to discuss pathways towards ramping up the renewable energy capacity in Africa, and of course, by that, reducing fossil fuel dependence. We also want to discuss universal access to energy, very important. We're looking for an inclusive dialogue between government officials, energy and climate policy experts, development partners, civil society representatives, looking at what can be done in the real world, see what are the challenges, what are the possibilities, and the actions needed to ensure maybe even an African leadership in the global energy transition. I will now hand over to our facilitator, Karabo Mokgonyana. Please take the stage.
Thank you so much, Peter. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Karabo Mokgonyana. I am a renewable energy campaigner from Powershift Africa and would like to warmly welcome you to the side event. I will be your facilitator for the next hour and a half, or minus the 10 minutes that just happened. As Peter, put in terms of the context for this event, we really just want to discuss the context of what pathways and opportunities exist in implementing SDG7. I don't want to give any more context. I really just want to welcome our keynote speaker, who will really discuss the opportunities and pathways around the COP28 energy package and what this means for the African continent. Without further ado, I'd like to warmly welcome Professor Fadhel Kaboub, who will be our keynote speaker for today.
Thank you, Karabo. Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. Before I proceed with my remarks, I'd like to introduce this short video that we'll watch for a few minutes, and then we'll proceed. Thank you.
Deutschland unterstützt weiterhin fossile Projekte auf dem afrikanischen Kontinent. Für Energie auf Kosten der Ärmsten. Es ist Zeit zu handeln.
These companies are after making more and more profits from Africa, extracting more and more fossil fuels.
They don't respect the human rights when they are making their activities, mining activities. When we are saying about 27 oil block, it means is on land which is occupied by community.
We are the voices of over 100,000 people, the voices for the voiceless communities out there. They're looking at us as their hope, and we are not ready to disappoint them.
Nous avons intérêt à protéger, à dire non à ces grands exploitants. Partout où il y a de l'exploitation des ressources minières, la communauté locale, la communauté riveraine a une pauvreté extrême.
We can't sell our life, we can't sell waters, we can't sell our rivers because we need the money.
These people went down and displaced over 100,000 people from their lands.
Sometimes they lose their lives, they are prohibited from going places, they are restricted from going into areas where they previously has been used to going.
Children are no longer going to school because of what is happening.
The environment is being polluted over time. There is oil pollution and air pollution.
Population don't have food, population don't have electricity.
The next generations are yet to suffer from this pipeline, which we cannot accept to happen.
We might lack resources, but we have the courage, the audacity and determination to continue fighting.
In vielen Ländern kämpfen mutige Menschen gegen die Zerstörung durch Öl, Gas und Kohle. Stell dich an ihre Seite.
Well, thank you. I want to start with Africa's current position when it comes to energy. When it comes to energy access, we have, as we speak, more than 600 million people on the continent who have no access to electricity. But at the same time, if you consider a recent report by IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, about the African continent, in a nutshell, this technical report concludes that the African continent, by 2040, which is the day after tomorrow on the clock, by 2040, the African continent can produce 1,000 times its anticipated energy needs from renewables, 1,000 times, and completely replace all the fossil fuel exports from the continent. That is the real potential that is within reach in a matter of years. The only challenge is the African continent today over the last 10 years, on average, attracts less than 2% of financing that goes towards renewables. Less than 2%. Global financing. And most of the infrastructure that is being built for renewables, especially solar and wind and geothermal, is actually not designed to deliver to the 600 million people who are left without energy access, but rather primarily to export either electricity to Europe or green hydrogen, or to manufacture products that are assembled with green energy to be exported to the global economy. And that means energy access, as you know, as you all know, no country can function without energy. No development, no prosperity can take place without energy access. So this is the puzzle that we have. In addition to that, we have a continent that has all the strategic minerals that are needed for a real green industrial revolution to manufacture and deploy the building blocks of development and prosperity, to manufacture and deploy the renewable energy infrastructure that will unleash that potential. So we have a puzzle here that is sort of disturbing, right? When we talk about the climate crisis, the need not only to decarbonize our activity in the African continent and increase energy access, but also to help decarbonize the rest of the world. If we have a continent that can produce this much surplus of clean and cheap electricity, why are we not unleashing that potential? And I'll put some, facts on the table for us to consider here. You have to recognize that the African continent continues to this day to play an economic function that was designed during colonial times and persists to this day. We are supposed to be the continent that produces cheap raw materials for the industrialized world. We still play that function today. We're supposed to be the consumers of industrial output and technologies from the industrialized world. In our large consumer market, we're the size of China in terms of consumer market. We still play that role today. And number 3, and most importantly, we're supposed to be the place where obsolete technologies, assembly line manufacturing that is no longer needed in the industrialized world is outsourced to us under the label of development and cooperation, but effectively it locks us at the bottom of the global value chain. So these 3 core economic functions prevent the African continent from escaping the bottom of the value chain, from escaping the bottom of the hierarchy. And if we're talking about unleashing the renewable energy potential of the African continent, it's not about unleashing it by importing the infrastructure to deploy, to produce the electricity for exports. That will be the worst case scenario in the case of the African continent. But it's about taking the opportunity of green industrialization, using the economies of scale, which is what you need for industrialization. The economies of scale that we have on the continent, not country by country, but at least in terms of regional blocks. Economies of scale meaning you have to produce a large volume of a particular product in order for you to reach economies of scale, reduce the cost per unit, allow for efficiency and innovation to kick in. And we do have that at the continental level, at the regional level on the continent. We also have the complementarity of resources and capabilities. We have the youngest labor force on the planet. What is missing is access to what I call life-saving technology. The technology to manufacture and deploy the renewables at scale, solar, wind, geothermal, and beyond. So this technology, life-saving technology, is available everywhere. It's available in Europe, in the US, in China, in Japan, in Australia. What is missing is the political will and coherent strategy to replicate the entire value chain of manufacturing solar, wind, geothermal infrastructure, not in one particular country, but distributed evenly across the entire continent, relying on the complementarity of resources and capabilities, each according to their capabilities, training the labor force that will staff and deploy this infrastructure, and building the transportation network, the clean transportation network, which also can be manufactured on the continent. We're talking about high-speed rail technology that needs to be deployed on the continent. And then adding the third most important component in addition to energy and transportation, which is clean cooking infrastructure. For the 950 million people who are inhaling toxic fumes on a daily basis on the continent, mostly women and children. And when you address clean cooking, it's energy, it's health, it's deforestation, it's climate, it's gender justice, everything is packaged in this. So the three biggest priorities that we need to plug into the energy access component is transportation, clean cooking, and of course, energy infrastructure. All of this is possible, but we need to have the political commitment, not at the national level. It has to be regional cooperation. It has to be South-South, South-North cooperation to unleash this potential. The good news about this is that this would be a $0 climate action plan. Most of you are surprised. You mean we don't need any money? Of course you need money, but every country contributing to this joint industrial policy will pay their workers in the national currency. You don't need external financing for this. Will pay for their resources in their national currencies. The part where we usually need external financing is to buy the manufacturing technology. But if we have joint ventures with countries who have the technology contributing in kind to replicate the value chain, you essentially need no external financing, because this will be a joint venture, South-South, South-North cooperation. And then when you have imbalances between countries contributing in their own currencies, central bankers know how to stabilize exchange rates. We have things called swap lines that have been used very effectively during the COVID crisis, during the 2008 financial crisis between the US, Europe, Japan, Australia. We know how to stabilize currencies. So external financing is not the obstacle. It's political will and cooperation that will allow us to unleash this full potential, which happens to be coincidentally not only the thing we need for climate action, but it's also the thing that we need for real development, for structural transformation, for the African continent to finally escape the bottom of the economic and geopolitical hierarchy. And that's the kind of new multipolar world in which you have Africa and the global south, the richest economic bloc in terms of resources, at the center of a new international economic order of peace and sustainable prosperity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fadhel. There was so much richness from that keynote, especially in terms of just how do we prepare, how do we capitalize all these different factors from the large population that Africa has in terms of the labor preparation, the life-saving technology that he spoke about, but even just the conducive climate that exists on the continent to facilitate a lot of whether it's transitions and access to energy. And that really leads us well into our panel discussion. And I'd like to call on our panelists. Our first panelist is Heike Hen, who's the Deputy Director General for Climate, Energy and Environment at the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. Please give her a round of applause. Our second panelist is Natalie Mangondo, who is a Principal Expert in Sustainable Finance for Nature at Grid Arendelle and an Article 6 negotiator for Zimbabwe. Please. And our last panelist is Dr. Dean Bekumuzi Bebe, who is a Senior Just Transition and Campaigns Advisor at Powershift Africa. Let me just join them. Okay. Just a reminder, if you need translation, there are headphones and they are at the back there. Thank you so much for joining this panel. We have a guiding question. You have 3 minutes each in terms of just your opening remarks and your thoughts about the conversation that we're having, just around, the COP28 energy package and the pathways and opportunities that Africa has to actualize SDG7. And our guiding question is that Africa should be at the forefront of efforts to meet the global collective goals outlined in SDGs and GST, including its associated COP28 energy package. However, the implementation of these goals must be pursued in a nationally determined manner, reflecting Africa's unique challenges and opportunities. What is needed from national policy, development partners, trade unions, and international civil society to enable the leapfrogging to 100% renewable energy and 100% energy access in a socially just and environmentally friendly manner, and how can COP29 contribute to this? I'll start off with Heike.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, good morning, and thanks for the great opening and keynote. And thank you also for setting the tone with what is essential also from the German perspective. It's not only about climate, it's not only about Paris, it's about the SDGs, and it's also about a new, fair and sustainable, equitable energy system that leaves the inequalities of the fossil era behind it, not only CO2, but also the inequality attached to it. And I think moving forward, I very much also listen to you speaking about the potential of the African continent, very important, and also about the injustice specifically regarding the lack of energy access as a key component for development. So for us from the German perspective here at COP, but also in what we try to support with partner countries, is really focus on access and decarbonization or leapfrogging fossils for sustainable and equitable growth and prosperity. So this is the North Star that is important. I think what gets us there, that was the other part of the question, I would start really with the key component of country ownership for this pathway. And from this ownership comes really a strong political signal for planning the energy system in a renewable way that also provides access for all people, giving the right signals to development partners and the market. And I think the second thing I would like to highlight is the continental perspective. Because for the business model of renewables and the energy system, I think the African countries did a great thing to agree on the AFSAM and CMP, the continental single power market, because this is a perspective that really allows for growth and managing renewables in the system and having really a prosperity and development as its core. The third thing I would like to mention for the growing population, the huge potential of the many young people in Africa is really to have a great joint effort on green skills. Because the potential must be challenged in a direction, so really to lead to growth. And maybe you think, so far, a nice talk, but no finance yet. So I specifically wanted to highlight finance as the fourth and last part. So finance is important, but finance as such, and this is what we discuss here, you can do great things with $100 or euros, or you can just spoil it on, I don't know, chips and Netflix. It's also nice sometimes. But so money in itself doesn't produce access and doesn't produce decarbonization. So this is why I didn't start with finance. But having said that, of course it's important that the global north continue to lead on finance. Germany in the energy system in Africa until 2030 will provide 4 billion euros for energy alone. And we have to leverage private capital even more. And I think the framework conditions, the enabling environment that African countries can set by themselves. That is key to mobilize this kind of finance in really an equitable way. Thank you.
For that. Natalie, over to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much for having me here today. It's an honor to be on this panel among such esteemed colleagues. As you know, I work in climate finance, and so where you ended with finance, I will begin with finance and only mention finance. Just going back to the keynote address, I really do believe that the way in which developed countries should signal their political will, their commitment, is through financing the energy transition. But for me, what's really important is not just the quantity, which of course is important, as the keynote speaker mentioned, that Africa receives only 2% of renewable energy investments, despite housing 60% of the world's best solar resources. But it's about the quality of that finance. Is that finance going to make national governments even more heavily indebted? Is that finance equitable when you compare the interest rates associated with lending to Africa due to the perceived risk compared to lending to other regions in the world? Is that finance going to be contributing to the development and the just transition associated with communities in Africa? And so for me, this conversation and the key enabler, the key signal of political will of a just transition is through finance, both in its quantity, but also in terms of its quality. And so I would really implore developed countries to work with Africa and with other developing regions as partners. And I think it's so apt that the German Climate Pavilion says climate solutions fast and fair. The fairness comes in how developed countries engage with Africa. We don't, I'm not sure if I can speak for Africa, but from my perspective, we don't want it to be in the form of charity or aid or anything like that. It should be in partnership, in footstep, in a way that recognizes Africa's agency, Africa's potential, Africa's ability to leapfrog and become this leader within the energy transition. And I think it was mentioned by the keynote speaker, but we really need to reframe this narrative that it's in the form of aid, rather developing Africa's renewable energy potential helps in terms of energy security in developed countries, in terms of price stability in developed countries. And so I think the type of partnership, the type of financing provided, essentially how we do this, not just that we do this, is the most important part of this discussion. Thank you, I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Dr. Bebe?
Thank you. Started with finance, ended with finance. Just going to be in the middle, in the sweet spot. So I think on my end, the most important thing we need to acknowledge are the underlying issues that currently exist in Africa that makes it difficult to access finance, but at the same time that makes it very difficult for us to tackle the energy crisis. Currently, as Fadhel said, we're at 600 million, but if we continue with the trajectory, by 2030 we're looking at over 720 million Africans without energy access. But what is important is creating a vision that will not only tackle the climate catastrophes, but also help pave way for sustainable, clean energy solutions, one that will essentially unlock development for the African continent. So essentially, how do we create linkages between climate, energy, and development, but at the same time, while acknowledging the historical injustices that have till present currently trapped the African continent? Looking at the global financial architecture and where we currently sit, the idea that in the World Bank Group, for example, we only have 3 African directors representing African energy interests, for example. Looking at the African Development Bank, thinking that the United States, essentially, for example, is the leading shareholder, meaning the agenda that's being set is not fundamentally African. So we have a set of individuals that are setting the scene for Africa, but then it's not really based on lived experiences, and it's not Africans leading for Africa, which is the same problem that we're currently facing. Africa needs the right quality and quantity of finance, which is 100% true, but then you cannot necessarily prescribe the conditions to which how we're going to receive such finance without providing the means of implementation. The means of implementation becomes very important for the Global South, and quite important when we look at the nationally determined contributions. We are expected to transition towards renewable energy, yet we do not have the right finance to leapfrog towards that clean energy system. Africa currently has 8,625 gigawatts of potential of renewable energy, and out of that, only 62 gigawatts has been installed. That is less than 1%. So obviously, we're functioning in a system where, again, if we look at the illicit financial flows, if we continue with this trajectory, if we get the right quality of finance, if we do not address the structural deficiencies that currently are causing precariousness across the African continent, you can punch in 1 trillion, for example, but best believe under 2 years, 5 years, that 1 trillion will go back to the global north, because we have not tackled the structural differences that currently exist that have gotten to us as a continent to this stage and to this platform. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to come back to you, Dr. Pepe. Yeah, just on the point on the structural differences, just want to be a bit more, want to push you in terms of what those structural differences are and how do you see us dismantling those?
All right, thanks for that. It will take probably 5 hours to unpack this. I will do my best. But I think it's 4 key points. I think the first aspect is really essentially acknowledging that every country has got a different relationship with fossil fuels. So essentially, it's not a one-size-fits-all. And this relationship is either of high dependency or of low dependency. That really provides us with the groundwork as to what is exactly needed for us to transition to a renewable energy future. The second aspect is acknowledging that Africa currently possesses a critical asset base. And that asset base are transition minerals, your iron, your manganese, your chromium, your copper. Yes, there are historical injustices around extractives within the mining space, but because we own this asset base around transition minerals, it does provide us with an opportunity to leverage those transition minerals within the international space to acquire the right quantity and quality of finance that is complemented by a technology transfer that will assure that Africa becomes a renewable energy hub for the new emerging green global economy. The second aspect that I'd want to touch on is looking at it from a nationally determined contribution aspect. We've had Mission 300 being announced by the African Development Bank and the World Bank Group, for example. And they have initially phased out 15 countries for this initial phase. So we've got Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria, Angola, Senegal, Tanzania. The most common denominator is that, number one, all these 5 countries are currently servicing a debt of over 67% against the GDP. Now, they've been asked to draw up energy compacts that will essentially be reflected within the country's nationally determined contributions, right? But the other common denominator is that all these are gas or oil exporting countries, which provides us with an avenue where already Mission 300 has been pegged to distribute energy through a mini solar grid system because it's much more cheaper by 50%, meaning that the other 50% is through alternative energy solutions, which brings us to the problem around fossil gas as a transition fuel, right? And essentially, we need to start thinking around how we can counter that narrative and how gas is not green and how gas is not essentially a transition fuel, and essentially looking at it from a point of committing financial fraud. You cannot ask African countries to set up a gas infrastructure that in 10 to 20 years' time would be a stranded asset that would not be used for the new emerging green global economy in terms of how we understand the new emerging energy systems. The other aspect that we need to also look at is the vulnerabilities of countries across the African continent in terms of climate change reflect the environmental and social ambitions of the energy transition. For example, for countries highly dependent, there'll be significant disruption with regards to the social fabric of societies in terms of financial sector reforms and other aspects that we can consider. That means that funding in these spaces, or even looking at how businesses function, they are exposed to the idea that they might essentially close down. So how do we create a system where they actually feel empowered and in a way that they will not be swallowed up? So how does competition law as well play in this transition, and how we understand labor becomes quite important. And I think the other aspect is financing just transitions really imply high ambitions for quality and high quantity of finance, which I've fundamentally touched on. But what needs to be important, I think, is when we issue out, even looking at these new energy compacts that are coming out for these 15 countries, we cannot issue out loans, number one, that are not based on the country's local currencies as well. When we're looking at that aspect, if I am exporting crude oil for it to be returned as refined oil because I don't have refining capacities, I have to essentially then peg it at Nigerian naira, for example, right? Because that is what the Reserve Bank of my country is trading in within the stock market. Now, when I'm now buying it back as essentially crude oil that has been a refined product, I'm required to buy it either euros or US dollars, right? Because I'm buying it back from either the United States or from the European market, meaning I have to now change my nairas, which might have been different to the point to which I was actually exporting it in the first place, meaning that I am not breaking even. There's a fluctuation within the exchange rate. Meaning, in order for me to break even, I have to go back to the World Bank and borrow more money. There's this whole cycle of debt that we're entrenched in as African countries that we need to also fundamentally break if we are to meaningfully engage with these new 15 energy compacts around the first wave of Mission 300 that's being fostered by development financial institutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll come to you, Natalie, and Dean's answer really speaks well into the relationships we have with whether it's developed countries or, you know, financial institutions. And you spoke about how, you know, the relationships with these countries needs to allow for agency and not necessarily be exploitative. There's a saying that he who controls the money controls the nation. So how exactly do we ensure that the relationships are not exploitative, or how do we define this relationship? So what would be an effective relationship for Africa to have with these developed countries? Because it's easy for it to turn into neocolonialism, it's easy for it to be exploitative, it's easy for resources to be handed to countries as they flash money, you know, towards African countries.
Yeah, so I think the first area has already been mentioned, and that's in terms of bargaining power. So ensuring that we're doing this on a regional level will be really key to ensure that we have that bargaining power where that would prevent us from being exploited. I think the second area is something that's been discussed quite a lot over the past couple of years with reforming the global financial architecture. Now, what form that takes, different people have different opinions, but I think most people do understand and do agree that there is a need to ensure that different countries have an equal representative and actionable role within these different multilateral organizations and development banks as well. Because what we see in practice is that on paper, we're all equal in these different international contexts, but then in practice, unfortunately, that is not the case. And this is particularly true for Africa. And this is what creates that exploitative relationship, be it in the form of finance or debt servicing. And so there really is a need to change how these financial systems operate, not just for the benefit of Africa, but for their own survival in the future, because we do see a decrease in faith surrounding these different platforms, unfortunately, including in the COP process. And so without changing the fundamental ways in which they operate, in which they engage with each of the equal parties, it's a very scary future where we might not have these institutions, which objectively do quite a lot of good, but in terms of the bad, there needs to be a reassessing of how they conduct that.
Thank you so much. Round of applause, please. Heike, you mentioned something around private equity or private capital. One of the struggles around access to private capital, utilizing private capital, is that the social and equity components tend to be forgotten, especially in the energy space or energy access on the continent. One of the things that we've seen is a big shift towards private capital results in the just components, the equitable components being forgotten. How do we get to a point whereby we explore private capital, but in a manner that we don't forget the important aspects of communities, the people, and it's not just a profiteering conversation in energy?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question, and it's a very important one. When I speak about private sector engagement or the business case, I certainly mean it to be speaking to a just transition, and as I mentioned, the SDGs. So I think it's a bit how we, for ourselves, define the private sector, or what do we see as private capital. I mean, basically, the agriculture sector is 99% privately owned and organized, and nevertheless, there are big companies, but there are so many millions of smallholders. But this is a privately organized business or sector of the economy. And also investments in the energy system are more often than not made by private investors. But that can also be in mini-grids or solar home systems. It's not necessarily the big external investor coming into a country and exploiting it. When we, from the development perspective, speak about private capital, we certainly speak about local value chains, local value creation, and also local private sector engaging. And for which terms and conditions then private sector engages in country, I think I very much agree that the international finance architecture needs to, I don't know, ramp up and become modern or equitable. And I think within the World Bank and other institutions, Germany tried to be also an enabling partner for that. But also in country, countries set the conditions under which private sector then operates. And this is very important, really, always to keep in mind. It's for the people, for the communities, for the development, and set the conditions right in this just and fair way. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have time to take one or two questions. Okay, already have two hands there. Wait, Kirsten, maybe please get a roving mic. We'll take the two questions. Yes.
Good afternoon. Is it on? Yeah, it's on. My name is Günther Herrmeier. I'm from Germany, and we are a little bit more than a little bit worried that some countries in Africa choose for the nuclear issue as a solution to the climate crisis. I mean, maybe you realize how the situation is here and how the lobbyists are pushing more and more. They name themselves sustainable, renewable. So maybe this would be a question to our colleague from Powershift. How do you deal with this?
Yeah, thank you. I think there's been a surge of nuclear interests from Africa, particularly I think the World Bank, the representatives for the Africa group in the World Bank are driving and putting up proposals for nuclear expansion in Africa for energy needs. So that is 100% correct, and that has been confirmed. However, we are pushing back, and it's something that we've recently started doing, and we are strategizing, and we're coming together, essentially. I think there's a lot to still learn around nuclear energy and what it essentially means. I mean, surface level, we know it's dangerous. We know that there are strong environmental concerns, surface level, right? But then there are nuance around how we want to understand nuclear energy for us to craft a narrative, a campaign strategy, and that's something that as Africa we've recently started developing. But it does speak to the lack of representation, for example, in different financial institutions. Because again, we're asking 3 people to represent 55 African countries. That is not a genuine approach to actually how we want to tackle the energy needs. And I believe that's how we are now talking about gas and nuclear energy within the same statement. Again, this was also driven 2 years ago through the African Union common position that was proposed of gas and nuclear position for Africa's energy future that we drove back, essentially. So we're going to try to use that same framework to win this fight as well. But essentially, we have been flagged around it. We do see it as a major concern. And 100% we're ready to commit and provide the right capacity and technical support to movements and campaigns around understanding the dangers of nuclear energy.
Thank you.
And if I can just add a quick response to that. It's not necessarily a defense, but it's just a question to throw back to you. I'm not sure if you're familiar with game theory and the Nash equilibrium, where 2 parties, be it developed countries and Africa, acting in their own self-interests. So Africa is like, we need to develop, we need to increase energy access, we need some type of development for our people, and we can't access these international financial institutions, the types of funds that have been committed on flowing. You act in your own self-interest, and then all of us together, when all of us are acting in our own self-interest, end up in the worst state of the world, which might be the pathway that you're describing. So I would have some empathy when you're running out of other options. You'd likely choose the worst option as well.
Thank you so much.
Very much. Can you hear me? My name is Kevin Moll from Germany as well, from the German Institute for Development Evaluation. And we just did an evaluation on energy access. And one of the key aspects or key limiting factors was affordability in communities. And that's the first aspect of SDG7 as well, despite Germany and other donors providing a lot of financial and technical cooperation. So I would like to hear from you, how do you think we can tackle this affordability issue of acquiring renewable energy technologies at the community level, particularly in rural parts of Africa? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Any takers? So how do we tackle the affordability question for communities specifically?
Do you want to start? No? Oh, no? Okay. All right, thanks. Looking at across the African continent, yes, affordability becomes super important. How do you make energy access safe, accessible, and affordable because of the growing inequality gap? That also speaks around job creation as well, and the other essential building blocks that really feed into energy access to improve the socio-economic livelihoods, right? But also, it's also around the type of funding and the grants that come into Africa that actually set the cost of said projects. For example, in Kenya, in Garissa, the northern parts, there's a drought. The community there could not afford the irrigation pumps because they were run by diesel, because they had to then buy diesel to have the irrigation pumps to send water into their homes, because the area historically does not have enough people with enough buying power, right? We're talking about pastoralists. All they know in terms of wealth is cattle and camels, right? They don't know money. What then happened is some of the small grants that have come in to that northern parts have created solar heated water pumps for that community to actually not pay for the water access, and that's one way we've been able to tackle it. So I think it really goes down to the way of looking at it that global north countries do owe a climate debt to Africa, and that climate debt needs to be done in a way where it's socially governed and people are centered, and it's actually empowering people on the ground who actually have no idea how they've caused the climate crisis, but they're right at the center of that climate collapse, right? Then the other aspect is looking at the debt reduction strategies that need to come into Africa, and even debt write-offs, because we've seen that through various moments across history if we look at it, right? For example, the Marshall Plan. That was a debt write-off. The same could be applied across Africa. Thinking around how do we use special drawing rights as well, maybe as an idea, to create a method to which we can actually roll out something quite affordable for people. That was done in Africa when we wanted to get access to the COVID-19 vaccine. We tapped into SDRs, and that really opened up to us having access to the COVID-19 vaccine. So there are different ways that we can think around this, and I hope that helps. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So this leads us then into our fishbowl, and the person who had their hand up, we 100% invite you to come on stage when we do our fishbowl, so you can definitely interact with the panelists. So I'm introducing the fishbowl and how fishbowl works so that everybody has context. We're going to bring 3 other panelists here, and we're going to have a discussion. They're going to basically answer the main question around how do we get to that point of, actualizing and realizing SDG7, and questions of affordability, nuclear, labor will come up. If you have any sort of contribution, even a question to the other panelists, you're welcome to come take a seat. And how it works is that you will come on stage and replace one of the panelists who are sitting and make a contribution. Please take advantage of the discussion that we'll have. I'd like to then introduce the other 3 panelists who will join the existing panel for the fishbowl. I'd like to kindly introduce Catherine Abreu. Please come on stage. From International Climate Politics Hub. Oh, please stay. The panelists, please stay. Yes. Tendai. Is Tendai? Okay. Yeah. So we're going to leave it here, and then, like I said, come and replace them. So let's have our the new panelists in terms of, your thoughts on this conversation and any sort of contributions that you felt were left out, and even answering some of the questions.
Very much. My name is Tendai Makanza. I'm from IndustriAll Global Union, Sub-Sahara Africa. I think what caught me quite at the beginning was the potential of Africa. But then getting all, revolving around the challenge of political will and commitment. And I kind of felt that the panel skirted that. And yet it seems to be right at the core of the negotiations themselves. And the interesting thing, Natalie, is that I resonated so much with everything. I'm from labor, but I was like, she's really spot on terms of what Africa needs in terms of quality financing. I think as trade unions in Sub-Saharan Africa, we're actually going a lot further and saying we want debt cancellation as part of the package, because we feel that when we look at issues of debt justice and sovereignty, if we are to really finance this, then there must also really be an element of debt cancellation. There must also be the issues that grants, aid, and development is not a new thing. We've had historical relationships under economic partnership agreements, EPAs with Germany, for example. And the question was always the access, the distribution of these resources to actually support the implementation of commitments. And then when we look at the experiences of JET EPs in South Africa and currently in Senegal, it kind of already shows the challenges with the definition of how quality this financing is. But I did also have a question for Natalie in saying, I agree 100% that developed countries need to show their political will and commitment through quality financing. But how would African governments also show their political will and commitment? And especially as trade unions, my interest is in safeguarding labor and trade union rights, and especially when we look at the challenges along the critical mineral supply chain. Would the start, for example, be African heads of state, for example, signing off into African Union Business Human Rights and Due Diligence Framework, before I even speak and comment about the due diligence framework in Europe? Thank you.
Thank you. Catherine, and then we'll come to you.
Is that working? Yeah. Thanks for opening up the conversation on critical minerals, because that was something that really struck me. I was also taken with the highlighting of the opportunity in Africa, and I had the question, how do we avoid replicating some of the very negative and harmful trends that we've seen in the existing energy system, particularly when it comes to the economic impacts and trade implications as we move toward renewable energy, given the fact that many of the critical minerals that will drive that renewable energy takeover are in Africa. And I think that that conversation actually connects into the conversations that we're having here at COP29, because the high-level advisory group on critical minerals actually reported to this COP, and I attended that roundtable last week, and they've come up with some really interesting principles for how we ensure that as the critical mineral development is pursued in order to achieve that tripling of renewable energy that was committed to in the energy transition package at COP28, that we're making sure there's equitable benefits sharing, that there are governance systems in place to ensure some of that wealth actually trickles down to people, isn't sucked up into the hands of a few elite, how to make sure that there's value addition so that we don't continue this trend of African nations exporting raw materials and not being able to take advantage of the economic opportunities that come along with adding value to those materials, and how we change the trade system so that fair trade practices and market access are actually, creating a positive atmosphere for African nations to benefit from that transition. So I'd be really curious to hear how other folks on the panel are thinking through this piece. And then the other, I also had some thoughts around debt. And, we just this morning woke up to the communique from G20 leaders coming out of the Rio summit, where they had some things to say about the reform of the international financial architecture. But I don't think that those major powers who do ultimately have a tremendous amount of influence in the rules that are set by the international financial system have really come around to talking about the issue of debt to the extent that we need them to. So would be curious to hear others' reflections on the panel or in the audience on that piece.
Thank you. So that's an invite to anybody in the audience who could speak on debt, critical minerals. I will come to Natalie and Laetitia. Please come replace one of the panelists. Please go ahead.
Hello. Okay, perfect. So thank you so much, Tendai, for your really important question. And I do believe that all parts of our ecosystem have a role to play, and that includes national government, right? And I think it was mentioned by the Deputy Director General. The first point is that enabling macroeconomic environment, and one of the easiest things to do in that regard would be policy consistency. We know, for us people working in policy, that between ministries, and of course climate change is a cross-cutting issue, between ministries the policy is inconsistent. Between departments the policy is inconsistent. Even here at the UNFCCC, we're not sure that it's aligned with the CBD biodiversity framework. And so I'd say policy consistency is one of those tools to really ensure that we improve our macroeconomic environment. And then I'd say a second point is to leverage national government budgets. When developed countries, when philanthropies, when private sector is coming to the table, they want to know that you also have a stake in it. And it doesn't have to be an equal stake, but to know that the national government has made that commitment from their national budget is both a signal to different partners, but also a tool for accountability. So I'd say policy consistency, and then the second one would be to leverage our own national budget. And then I'd just add on to something that Dr. Bebe said, which was, debt for climate swaps and different innovative financial tools. I'd reiterate that they're not just buzzwords. These really are the tools that African countries have been using to go around this financial architecture that's not working for us and have something that is more context appropriate, that is risk adjusted, that is appropriate for the continent. And so I think African governments should really come to the table to leverage those instruments, but of course in a way that has high integrity, because we've been seeing a lot of integrity issues in both climate and carbon projects. So those are the three areas.
Thank you so much. So let's get some fresh perspectives from Laetitia, who's from CESAO. Laetitia, over to you.
Ok. Je vais m'exprimer en français. Merci,
I am going to
Karabo.
speak
Je
in
voudrais
French.
encore
Thank you very
remercier
much,
l'ensemble
Karabo.
des panélistes
I would
et
like
des
to thank
intervenants
all the
pour la
panelists
qualité de leur analyse qui,
for
je pense, enrichit
such
aujourd'hui nos
high
réflexions.
quality in their analysis, and I believe this
Je pense
enriches
que je
our
vais subdiviser
conversation.
mon intervention en 3 points.
So I am going
Dans un
to
premier temps,
devise
je pense que les politiques doivent être contextualisées selon les pays et selon les communautés locales. Dans un deuxième temps, je pense que les partenaires de développement et de la société civile doivent pouvoir faire un trait d'union entre les décideurs et les communautés et veiller à ce que les solutions
it seems that
énergétiques
we had
soient
lost the
durables et
speaker.
socialement justes.
How can we
Par exemple, nous
guarantee
avons
that
travaillé à
the
mettre en
energy
place un
transition
réseau de
is
la société
sustainable and
civile
socially just?
sur la
We have
région ouest
implemented
africaine
a
qui
civil
couvre
society
actuellement 5
network
pays
across West
et qui
Africa.
permet
It
d'avoir un
covers
impact
5
beaucoup plus
countries,
important
and it
auprès des
allows
décideurs.
for a much
Et dans un
greater
troisième
impact
temps, je
with
voudrais
decision
mettre
makers.
en avant les populations. Je pense que c'est le
And
point le plus
thirdly, I would
important,
like to
que
highlight
les
populations. I
communautés
believe
soient
this is
en
the most
premier plan
important
de
point.
cette lutte pour la
Communities
transition
need to be at the
énergétique.
forefront of
Professeur
this
Fadhel l'a
fight for
souligné dans le
just
discours introductif.
energy transition.
Les sources
Professor Fadhel
d'énergie renouvelables sur
highlighted
le
it in
continent
his
africain
keynote,
sont
and I
vraiment
believe that
d'un grand
renewable
potentiel.
energy sources
Pour
across
prendre un
Africa present
exemple et
great
illustrer
potential.
ces propos,
For example,
plus de 55% de la population
over
ouest-africaine
55%
évolue dans le
of the West
secteur
African
primaire et notamment
population
agricole.
works
Et
in the
cela
primary
contribue à
sector,
près de
mainly in
30% du
agriculture,
produit
and
intérieur
this
brut
contributes
régional.
to
Et ce
30%
secteur
of the
agricole
regional
génère
GDP.
pas mal
The
de
agricultural
résidus agricoles
sector
qui pourraient
generates
être utilisés
great
dans un cycle
agricultural
durable pour la
residue,
production de
which
chaleur
could
et
be used
d'électricité pour ces
in
populations.
a
Et je pense que dans ce
sustainable
sens-là,
way
la
for
COP29 doit
the
être comme un
populations.
catalyseur
I
pour
believe
que
that
réellement il y ait
COP29
plus
should be a catalyst
d'investissements pour les
so that
projets
there will be
énergétiques
more
dans la recherche et
investment for
développement,
energy projects,
pour que les
so that there
technologies
will
soient
be more
réfléchies
funds for R&D,
par rapport au
so that
contexte africain et puissent
technologies
être
can be
vraiment
thought out
adaptées au contexte
according
des
to the African
populations les plus
context
défavorisées.
and be adapted
Donc, je vais
to the
limiter mon
most
intervention à ce point.
marginalized population. This is what I had to say. Thank you.
Heiga, I want to just speak about, G20 is happening and the communique was released, but also to pick up from just your opinions on the critical minerals conversation.
Yeah, thanks very much, and also to the new perspectives brought in from you. And I very much agree, as I said in the beginning, that the new energy system, and that from my perspective also includes minerals, has to be, or not automatically is fair and equitable. It only is if we work in this direction and have really a clear understanding what are the dangers in falling in the same trap again and setting up a system that doesn't really put all countries on an equal footing with the same, or even better, like the potential from Africa is really to have a key role in the new energy system. And this is also true for minerals, but not only from the equitable side of things and labor rights and everything that is key, but also get these minerals out in a sustainable way. Because if we don't get this right, this will also not work for the country, but also for our joint planet. And looking at the G20, and what's coming out of it, from the debt perspective, I think the acknowledgement that there is a problem and we have to tackle it, that is there, but maybe not enough towards a solution. And from the German perspective, we certainly see that we need to engage, that the challenges and the need of investments in SDGs, in development, and also in leapfrogging the decarbonized system, the investment challenges are so huge, so countries should not have to pick between education, health, and climate or adaptation. We have to get all G20 in for a solution. So talk, of course, about the global north, but also talk about China when we talk about debt. And I think we also only find a solution together with all G20, not with bits and pieces in the financing architecture. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to just throw a question, and anybody could take it, around the labor conversation. There's conversations on preparing the labor force to transition, but there's certain patterns or concerns that are emerging as a result of the transition, and that is the sustainability of the new jobs that we are talking about. So, for example, a wind farm is being put together. Hundreds of people are hired to do the labor. After the project is done, people are without jobs. So there's a big question that's been placed on the table around job security and just transitions. Are there any suggestions of how we can actually deal with some of those concerns around job security? Do just transition bring sustainable jobs as is? Because what we are seeing is project-based transitions and not industry development, sector development. Any takers?
I guess it's quite obvious since I'm from the trade unions, but first I also want to look at this as a female trade union, and being excited that at the moment I realized it's an all-woman panel also now.
Whoop, whoop.
Yeah, and the need to also leapfrog. When we also speak about leapfrogging, it's not just about the question of just one component of energy access. It's leapfrogging also to the decent work deficits that exist in our region. And the assumption that in the negotiations we are starting at a point where labor rights are equitable or harmonized across our sub-regions and at global level. The challenge has always been that Africa is labor resource based. The transition will not only affect labor, but will be implemented by labor. And therefore, the need to address, when we look at the job loss, I know sometimes people say, oh, trade unions are a little bit selfish because they want to hold on to jobs that will not exist. This is not the conversation. We do realize, and I think we need to be honest about that, the transition will have winners and losers. That's the first thing. And that's why as trade unions, we are also demanding for social protection. We need to have in place social protection systems and mechanisms, and we need to go back and look at what happened with under COVID. This has really exposed Africa in terms of the weaknesses and non-existences of social protection, the quality of social protection. It's not just ticking a box to say there is some government that's giving $10 a month to individuals. Real social protection that will sort of cushion those that will be losers, and those are the majority that are workers. Let's go to the second level for us that's very critical. We cannot have these conversations without trade union present in the dialogue. And let's take a look at a picture of what's happening in this COP process itself. Labor has to fight to have the word labor, workers, employees in the text. This is problematic. Let's look at one of the stalling decision processes. This is the Just Transition Work Program. If you go to that text at the moment, you will have no idea that it's related to the labor component, especially in our regions. And I think, Natalie, maybe from our developed countries, we also need you to really push on protecting the labor rights of your own African workers. This is key. We have to start, of course, with the 8 ILO conventions, but we can't still be talking about the 8 core ILO conventions today. There are more conventions that our regions need to sign up and take on. There are due diligence frameworks that are there, but the question is access to them. Getting resolutions where rights are violated. How do we make this work? And we have to put all these issues at the center when we're talking about just transition.
Thank you. I saw Laetitia picked up her mic. I'd also like to really invite people to come on stage if you have any sort of contribution. Heike and Natalie, you are permanently seated, unfortunately.
If I can just respond to Tendai's comment, I fully agree with you 100%. And I think we really need to be intentional about, yes, we're phasing out of this exploitative, extractive system, but what are we phasing into? Are we going to have renewable energy, but then still have exploitation of workers? Are we going to continue to face inequality between developed and developing countries? Are we going to still continue to see inequality within countries? And so I think we really need to be thoughtful and could use your expertise on what it is we're phasing into.
Sorry, Catherine. Laetitia had a point, yes.
Merci, Karabo. Je pense que ta question m'interpelle encore
Thank you
sur
very
le
much,
dernier
Karabo.
point de mon intervention.
You know, this question really brings me back to the last point of my intervention, my previous intervention. I believe the energy transition should be more for the most marginalized group. It should create more jobs, and I would like to speak in a pragmatic way. Implemented technologies need to be thought for local populations. They shouldn't be imported technologies. There should not be implanted technologies that then die because there are no more jobs created. Technologies need to be created by local artisans with adequate training. Now let me talk about gender. When I mentioned agriculture and how agricultural residues are generated, many women work in agriculture and have agricultural residues. Technologies can be created to create electricity and heat with this agricultural residue. And they should be enrolled so that jobs will be perpetual. Should there be any shortcomings, we shouldn't need to look for technicians from abroad. What? We should train local workforce. This service should be beneficial to local populations. So I would like to insist on this because I believe that rural populations and marginalized groups can benefit most from this.
I'll make three points. I mean, one, just picking up on your point around needing to ensure local benefit. And I think that we've actually seen really important stories about the importance of locking in local benefit as renewable energy growth has occurred in other parts of the world. So my name's Catherine Abreu. I'm the director of the International Climate Politics Hub, which is a global network operating in climate diplomacy. But I'm Canadian, and I'll share a story from my experience of energy transition in Canada, where over 20% of the renewable energy projects are owned and operated in Indigenous communities, which is really flipping the current paradigm of our existing energy system on its head, right? Where Indigenous communities are largely paying through the nose for diesel generation and imported fuels that drive up the costs of all commodities in their communities, and are now many of them able to create local jobs, training, skilling up members of the community in order to develop some of those renewable energy projects and then run them over time. That being said, it is absolutely the case that when it comes to renewable energy, it's not the same kind of workforce picture that we see with fossil fuel-based energy systems. And that's why the conversation, this is my second point, around economic diversification is so important. We can't just think about this as a one-to-one transition, right? If we're thinking about the just transition, that means that we also need to be thinking not only about the sources of energy that we're switching, but also the other sectors in the economy that need, the low carbon sectors of the economy that need to be grown in order to provide those jobs and opportunities for workforces so that we're not so bound to workforces being attached to natural resource extraction. And then finally, I mean, this is a complicated question, right? Because it spans from the very local to the very international. And we have to kind of be thinking across all of these spheres of influence at the same time. And so while we think about these local impacts, local benefits, thinking about national economic diversification, we also need to be thinking about those international rules that kind of determine what success looks like, who gets to be competitive as these markets change. And that's why I think that issue around changing the rules so that African countries, indigenous communities in different parts of the world, other nations that are currently losing out on the existing energy system can actually start to become winners as we transition toward a renewable energy system.
Thank you so much. Welcome. The floor is yours. Please do kindly introduce yourself to the audience.
Alors, merci beaucoup. Je vais essayer un peu de parler en français.
Thank you very much. I am going to try and speak in French. My name is Fadhel. I am an activist from the DRC. I would like to speak about transition and corruption in countries such as mine, the DRC. We are faced with a very high issue pertaining to funds and finance traceability. I have a question. How can donors who are looking to find solutions for the energy transition, how can they manage traceability for funds for financing? For example, in countries such as the DRC, where we know that millions of dollars through the World Bank, the IMF, or other donors have been provided, but unfortunately do not lead to local communities taking advantage. Now, make a second question. I would like to know what alternatives are implemented when talking about fossil fuels. For example, when we talk about fossil fuel exploitation, I am speaking of DRC, Uganda, Tanzania. We see that governments want to exploit fossil fuels. So what alternatives do you have? How can you lobby and tell these countries, these governments, that they either should stop exploiting fossil fuels or else? Thank you.
Okay. So the questions put forward were around how do we get donors to ensure that the funds are traceable? Because even when funds are provided, we start seeing whether it's human rights violations in the Congo, we start seeing things that donors are detached from in terms of accountability, being able to trace and ensure that it's actually serving what it's meant to do. Any takers?
Yeah, thank you very much. Merci beaucoup pour la question. I think accountability.
Thank you very much for your question.
And showing the impact is key. Because as I said, I mean, finance as such doesn't change people's life for the better. It has the potential, but only if we use it in a good way. So I think to strengthen accountability systems and the transparency is important. I know for Germany, we publish really the list of all programs that are, for example, our international climate finance of around 6 billion annually from budget sources. I'm not speaking about loans. So we have really a list where you can see every single project. And not so rarely we get questions from people or journalists, for example, who go through this list and say, could you please explain me why this program is really for climate? I don't understand it. And then we check it and present the evidence. So I think this kind of transparent approach and really working jointly for impact is important. Regarding maybe briefly on the second point, if I understood this correctly, we heard a lot about context. So every country has a different position in the energy transition. And also, I agree with Natalie, policies are key, but knowing also policy making is difficult. So You just have to look at the German example. We keep course, but there is this bumps in the road. And so the perspective of countries is different. And so we as partner want to have a partnership in the sense that we don't say ha ha ha, but it's the NDC of the country, the 1.5 direction of the NDC that we have as part of the conversation, but it's rather a conversation than anything else. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And I just add on to that, you know, there are some centralized platforms where these things are tracked. So, for example, the NDC partnership has developed this partnership planning tool. But even when those things are in place, it's an administrative burden, both for countries who have different administrative capacities, as well as even donors. Donors oftentimes struggle to fill these out. There may be duplication across different types because just in terms of the NDCs, there's the NDC partnership planning tool, there's Dev Promise, and so sometimes countries are inputting to both, which results in inconsistent reporting. And so I think we really need to find ways to streamline these platforms even when they do exist, because if they do exist, yet both donors and developing countries aren't inputting it, then you know, it's not really useful. So that support to ensure that they can be used efficiently is important as well.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Over to you.
Merci beaucoup. Je suis Justin Tabesha.
Thank you very much. My name is Justin Tabesha from the Democratic Republic of Congo. We work on promoting renewable energies in our community. I come from North Kivu specifically, and I would like to speak on norms and standardizing. I would like to speak on climate funding. In Central Africa, you will see that it's not the same as in other countries which benefit from climate funding. For example, in Rwanda, they do not have the same prices for fuels as in Congo. For example, 1 ton of carbon can be sold for $200 in Rwanda and $600 in the DRC, so this is not fair. So I would like to take advantage of the presence of a representative from the German corporation to ask how are prices regulated. This is the first thing. The second thing, when it comes to European Union cooperation, for example. You know, in Africa, it is very important to speak of climate funding. It is very important to speak of the energy transition. I would like to say that there are prerequisites. So, practicability, access to technology. Accessibility as a prerequisite, again, I would like to speak of peace. For example, there are reports citing bad cooperation in Africa, especially in the Great Lakes region. So many very things to review before we can speak of the energy transition. Where I'm from, in the DRC, only 13% of the population has access to energy. 90% of the population still uses traditional means of cooking food. The population still uses firewood for cooking. And this leads to many diseases and illnesses. For example, when it comes to cooperation, energy transition starts with improving health for women while they're cooking. Here, we're talking about different agreements. We're talking about the energy transition. And we have to think about how African women cook food and how we can protect children's health in households. Thank you.
Question, and perhaps you can take the second one. Would that
Okay.
be okay?
Please keep it short. We have 3 minutes left.
I'll be very quick. So in terms of the difference in carbon pricing, if we're being very honest and very frank, it comes down to marketing, right? So I think it's really important to highlight, as I was saying, what are we phasing into, right? Are we going to continue in terms of inequality, be it in the form of carbon pricing or be it in the form of workers' conditions? So in terms of carbon pricing, it comes down to marketing. It comes down to show the perception that people have about different regions and different countries within that regions. And so I think it's really important that we as a global community develop a framework within the carbon market space or an understanding, a shared understanding about what high integrity is. Because you always hear people saying high integrity carbon market project. You hear people talking about health co-benefits and all these different things, but in practice we don't have indicators and measures. Well, we first don't have definitions for what those things mean, but then we also don't have measures to assess them. So I think that's what will solve the disparity. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And thank you again for the second question. Also, I think clean cooking or the situation of the hundreds of women and children that don't have the means to clean cooking and have to suffer all the health problems due to it is really something that we as a community have not solved. There is not an easy solution from so many programs also on the carbon market. We know that even if you get LPG out to households, then it's not always used and the effect is overrated because what the context of the families, the needs, and what often the husbands want the women to cook is not the new solution always. So how to really get something to all the women and men who cook to get clean solutions out there is really something we have to solve as a global community.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to the panelists, and thank you so much to the audience as well. I think the discussion was very robust: critical minerals, clean cooking, debt, nuclear energy. We've really covered a big base in terms of the conversation. Let us take the conversation from COP to really actualizing SDG7 for the African continent. Thank you so much for joining us.
Welcome to the German Climate Pavilion at COP29 in Baku. Germany. Climate solutions, fast and fair.